I'd like to hand over to Christina Ellinsen. So Christina is the Women's Human Rights Campaign Country Contact for Norway, and she's going to give us an update on what's happening in Norway in terms of self-ID and in terms of activism. So thank you so much for coming, Christina, and over to you.
I thought I would take the opportunity to basically just explain what Women's Human Rights Campaign Norway is, and how we are using, well, how the campaign is run in Norway. Since the Women's Human Rights Campaign is the only campaign which has produced a systemic review of the explicit relationships between biological sex, the universal human rights, and women's rights, it is an incredibly powerful resource for women everywhere to use to protect their human rights, basically. Well, obviously it is. So even though the declaration was initially written in response to a situation in the UK, because it has been written in the way that it has, they have given us all such a gift, because it is internationally applicable, and it's possible to apply it to, to not only to your national status, your national situation, but also on local situations. And Britain by far has made such a massive impact on how gender identity can be understood, and how the threat to women's rights can be understood. So I'm just so incredibly grateful for the work that you guys have done, that Sheila Jeffries and Heather Brunskill-Evans, Maureen O'Hara, and of course Joe Brew has done in terms of writing and mapping out exactly what it is that's happening when we replace biological sex in law with the subjective understanding of gender identity. In order to systematically wage the campaign in Norway, I have set up and registered Women's Human Rights Campaign Norway as a charity. Because since the politics and activism to remove the legal frameworks and legislations around biological sex, it's not going to go away, and it's being waged incredibly well organized. It's very well funded, and there's no way we can protect women's rights or the situation unless we go about it as systematically as they are doing, or as this politics is being introduced. When you remove such a fundamental factor as biological sex from legal settings, the domain that is affected is huge. I mean, women's rights are it's the most important part of those domains, because it's also where biological sex has the most explicit application, and it is the foundation for women's discrimination and for women's rights. So it's just simply not enough to engage in conversations on Twitter or writing a letter here and there. It has to be waged systematically, and the declaration and Women's Declaration and Women's Human Rights Campaign is just such an incredibly useful tool to sort of fight back. In Norway, what we do, the purpose of WHRC Norway, I mean, the Women's Human Rights Campaign is a campaign. It's not an organization like that. It's a specific campaign which are asking people to take a stand on a very specific set of questions, and it's written in a way that makes it applicable to very specific situations as well. So the campaign in itself is not an organization, but the charity that we've made it's a way to be able to wage that campaign as systematically as possible. So what we do is that we basically promote the campaign, obviously. The technique we're using for that is to apply every time we see a situation that is relevant to biological sex and women's rights. We find the article in the declaration, and we use that incident as an excuse to educate and to demonstrate the practical consequences of gender identity the practical consequences of replacing biological sex with gender identity, and then we use the declaration to show how explicitly and specifically such a replacement is a human rights violation for women. And then our organization, as an organization, we also accommodate for women to study the situation, study the laws, to share information and perspectives, specifically around the practical implications of removing an objective defined factor in human rights with a subjective factor. And then the purpose of having like a national organization specifically for this campaign is also to make it possible for women to find us, to find other women, so that women can, well, basically find each other and find support in each other. So our charity offers memberships. We have 3 levels of memberships. And as members, full members are invited to join our study campaigns, our political campaigns, and all these subgroups are organized around the articles in the declaration. And we are also launching a workshop, a practical workshop every week. We're going to start doing that in the end of January. The workshop combines women's human rights, women's history in Norway, with technology and crafts. And then during the workshop, we then make things specifically, whilst we also discuss the practical applications of women's rights, basically. So we've been running the pilot this November, and we're going to launch the real thing by the end of January. The purpose of these workshops is to create a hands-on social and practical activity, which is empowering for women, basically. So the situation in Norway, the Norwegian language doesn't differentiate between biological sex and gender to begin with. So we use the word kjønn, which essentially means biological sex. But in the English languages, you can separate between gender and sex in a way that that makes it very clear whether you're talking about the material thing or if you're talking about the social constructs surrounding the sexes. And since we don't have that distinction in the Norwegian language, the proposals for self-ID and all the proposals for gender identity law and changing sex everywhere, nobody understood what they were talking about. Like the problem that we're dealing with, in terms, the consequences of replacing a biological objective material factor with a subjective, relative, and vague feeling. Nobody realized, I think a lot of people didn't realize, because the word sex, or the word sex in Norwegian, kjønn, it can mean both things. So that's one thing. The result of self-identification in Norway is that anybody above the age of 6 can send in a form, can fill in a form online, and then receive a new national security number or personal identification number, because legal sex in Norway is marked in your identification number. So to change legal sex in Norway, you basically change your identity number. And this was done without any thoughts or concerns about women's rights whatsoever. And there were no discussions about it anywhere. So I've contacted the criminal service, for instance, and asked them, so how are you planning on combining your declared plans of securing women's rights in prisons, whilst also meeting the discrimination laws surrounding gender identity? And it's problems that they never thought about, because they were never included in a critical discussion about what it means to self-identify, or what it means for the usage of these identification numbers. And many people still believe that when you talk about someone termed a trans woman, they think that is a woman who wants to be a man. They don't understand that they're actually talking about a man who claims to be a woman. So the entire concept of what a trans woman is, or what a trans person is, people did not think about it properly 5 years ago, and it's too absurd for most people to even grasp. So that's the basis in Norway. Anybody above the age of 6 years old can change their legal sex, and there's no way to verify whether or not there's no way to verify what biological sex Norwegian citizens have, because it's not registered anywhere. I mean, it's in the public records, it's not registered anywhere. In Norway, we also have the Rainbow Lighthouse certification program, which is basically the same as they've had in the UK in terms of the Stonewall training, whether they dedicate themselves to, where companies dedicate themselves to make real changes in their structures in order to accommodate around gender identity. And they have launched that already. They've launched it this year, and they have already enrolled one school for children have already received a certificate for this. And these certificates then, it's just shocking. It's a shocking misuse of democratic process that a private lobby organization can go into publicly democratic organizations and get them to change their legal procedure, change their procedures without. I mean, they're bypassing our democracy, and it's just shocking. So we have the same scandal that we've seen with Stonewall and the BBC. It's right here in the cards in Norway as well, because there's. We started with the same kind of certification programs that they've had in the UK. In February, we reported Shinigami Ice, the surveillance tool that's used to track specifically women and lesbian women and radical feminists. We reported them to the Data Protection Authority, and they sent a letter demanding a clarification from the developers of Shinigami Ice to prove that they had the valid reasons to collect the kind of information that they had according to GDPR laws.